But the biggest challenge that we've got as a party is to come up with a credible economic platform that provides fiscal space to drop taxes and do other things that we'll need to do, social care challenges and challenges of reaching out to younger people, for example. It's all going to cost money ultimately at the end of the day, and you've got to find that space to do it. So it's a big economic challenge.
It is, and I can't disagree with anything you say, Mel, but to play devil's advocate here,
do Mel.
It feels to me, some might say, well, that sounds very similar to what Keir Starmer wants to do. Grow the economy. We're not going to have austerity, we're not going to raise taxes, albeit now they're saying they're going to raise taxes, but his whole pitch was economic growth to create that fiscal headroom.
No, so we agree on the tree that should be barked up.
Yeah.
But he's got the wrong dog, okay? Mine's a different dog that's doing the barking.
I'm Ben Houchin, this is the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. Well, introducing today's guest, we've got Mel Stride. Welcome, Mel. Thank you for coming.
Ben. Great to be here.
Thank you. So, people might not know who you are, Mel. So, Mel, you were first elected as an MP for Central Devon in 2010, educated at Oxford, and you've actually held a number of very high-profile government positions, from Financial Secretary to the Treasury, most recently through to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. And I think it's fair to say that you're known for your fiscal acumen and experience. And now you're sat here because you're a contender for the leadership of the Conservative Party. So thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. Pleasure. Having said that, I've given you a very, very short introduction about your political background. One of the things that I hear from members, really interestingly enough, as this leadership contest is starting, is they don't know much about Mel Stride, the person, and the background. I mean, like I say, you've been on our tellies a lot for the last couple of years, but I can't imagine that many people know what your history is before 2010 and before politics. So I think... If you wouldn't mind, let's start out. Who is Mel Stride and what was he before he was a politician?
God, that's a big question, Ben. Who is Mel Stride? Right, okay, where do you start? I went into Parliament aged 48, which is quite unusual. And most people that I meet and you talk to about politicians, one of the things they say is, look, we want people that have got experience in the real world, whatever that means. And I think that's what I bring to this contest. So what I did as a younger person was set up my own businesses, sitting at the kitchen table, coming up with the ideas, getting groups of people together, missioning everybody with a clear objective and storming those metaphorical mountains. And I think that showed leadership. Now, I built businesses in that way, both here and in the United States. And that kind of sense of opportunity and aspiration and achievement that was certainly back there in the 1980s is a flame that burned brightly then, and I think has become too obscured of late. And that's the flame that I want to see burning brightly again in the Conservative.
So when you started your business, so it was in the 80s that you started your first, what was the first business? How did that come about?
So, well it's an exhibition company. It was focusing on exhibitions, so trade shows, that kind of thing. And I had this idea about getting more people to go into manufacturing and industry rather than into areas like the city and accountancy, coming out of universities and going into industry. And my idea was I get them all together and I take them to my old university, Oxford University, and I showcase what young people were doing in all these different businesses and turn them on to a career in industry. So I took a day off work and I got the Times 100 largest industrial companies list out, and I phoned the chairman's office of every single one of them. I was only 24 at the time, I think. And it was a numbers game. And I thought, well, if I just phone through this entire list, 100 calls, somebody is going to pick the phone up. And actually, the chairman of Shell, then a man called Sir Peter Holmes, he's since passed away, sadly. I didn't actually get through to him immediately, but I left a message with his assistant. And I'd been phoning very early in the morning because I thought before the PA gets in, I'll try and get the main man. Anyway, the phone rang and I was in the shower and I picked it up and he said, it's Sir Peter Holmes here. So I said, oh, gosh, great. I said, look, I'm 25 years old and I've got this idea about promoting industry to young people to get them to take up these careers. And he let me talk for about 10 minutes and I realised I was beginning to get through. And he said, well, I don't know whether your idea is very good or not, but what are you doing for lunch tomorrow? So I said, well, nothing. So
a bit bizarre, 24-year-old getting
in front of he sent a car round and he took me out to lunch and I sold him my idea. And he said, I'll help you. And he introduced me to the chairman of some of the largest businesses, IBM and Marks and Spencer and all the big companies in the UK at that time. And I went from board to board saying, look, if you want to recruit young people into industry, you're going to have to get together and showcase what you're doing and what you've got to offer. So I had a big show up in Oxford in 1987. Had the Director General of the CBI, then John Banham, opened it for me. I was live on the Today programme with it, talking about it with Brian Redhead and all that kind of stuff. And we reached about 9 million people with that one project. And it took me about 7 months to get it off the ground. And what I had on my hands then was a business, because, of course, I'd sold the space at this event to all these companies. And then I got into the exhibition business and a bit of publishing and some conference organisation.
And is that something that you're passionate about then? Because it's something I'm particularly passionate about, manufacturing and industry within the UK.
Yeah.
Is that something after you left that business and moved into politics? Is that something you've been involved with much of?
So, well, I've always seen the importance of business. Now, look, manufacturing is really absolutely critical, but of course so is the service sector. And if you look at much of the growth and the strength of the UK economy, it is a service-based economy now. But absolutely the importance of business, particularly entrepreneurship, in driving growth, which in turn is getting, with productivity increases, people's real wages up and standard of living up and paying the taxes that fund the public services that we all depend upon. So I see the source of the river, if you like, or of all the good things as being coming from business, and particularly SMEs and people that are allowed to go out and be creative and build things in the way that I did as a younger person.
The interesting question, if you had a young Mel Stride here today who's 24, so it's not the 80s anymore, are you still ringing the chairman of Shell trying to get hold of him? Or are you ringing, the chairman of Spotify and OpenAI? I mean, where do you see the future of that? Because I still think there's a role for what people would see as more traditional manufacturing in the UK. But, I also appreciate that the world moves on. And so what would a 24-year-old Mel Stride be doing when he's hitting those phones trying to sell
he'd be dealing with different companies. So if you looked at the Times Top 100 now and compare what it was back in 1987, I don't know how many of those companies would still be present in that list, but probably very, very few of them. But the exciting end is the advanced manufacturing, the pharmaceutical sector. So the green stuff that you're involved with, for example, up in Teesside, those are the areas of the future. But what I'm also very interested in is startups that then get spun out, can get scaled up, which is something that historically we've been rather weaker at. Although there are centres of excellence. Oxford University has done brilliantly actually at taking spin outs and taking them up to the next level and so on. So I think that's got to be fundamental to our economic growth going forward.
I absolutely agree. It's one of those things that people talk about and have been talking about for years. Spin outs. How do we capture IP that's created in our fantastic universities? How do we help them grow? We always look across the pond to the US and how well they do it compared to us.
Yeah.
And they're a bit in different schemes over not just the last Conservative administration, but going back to the Labour administration in the noughties as well. Why did they fail in the way that our American partners have succeeded, and how would you try and create that entrepreneurial spirit and that ability for people to create a business and then spin it out from a potentially university institution into the next Microsoft, Facebook, Shell, whoever it might be?
So I think some of it, it's a hugely good question because this country, of course, has a huge, deep well of finance. We are a world leader in finance, as they are in America. I think the risk appetite is very different here, and we're just not kind of, for whatever reason, orientated towards diving into those kind of proposals. We've done stuff on the tax side, like the EIS schemes and SEIS and various tax rates and venture capital incentives and so on, and we probably need more of that. I think we should look at places like Oxford University that have bucked that trend and have been very successful at taking the small and making it larger and bolting in the finance as well, and try and learn from that and cookie cut it out elsewhere. So that in terms of, if we're getting onto leadership, the kind of things that I would be doing in terms of forging the economic platform for the future, is I'd be drawing those kind of people in and doing a whole piece of work around exactly what we should learn from them and how we should go forward on them.
No, it's interesting, and apologies, we've got slightly off piece there. So but so getting back to Mel, So you started your own business, you grew the exhibition business, you started getting into things like publishing, as you were saying, and then how did that journey transition from business into wanting to get into politics?
So
It's not usual.
Yeah.
Right? There aren't that many successful entrepreneurs and businessmen that get into
that's
politics.
true. I'd always been interested in politics. Ever since I was very young, I knew that politics mattered. I didn't grow up in a political family, but I did grow up in a family in which my father had a small business and was struggling away with that, very successfully in the end. But I knew that politics mattered because I heard around the kitchen table that they were concerned about who got into power. And
so it's not capital P politics.
So
it
mattered.
It's the issues
it was. And it was a very
impact.
conservative journey. So I was the first person in my family to go to university, and I went to Oxford, and I went to a grammar school, and my parents had left school at 15 and 14, and I saw what giving something an opportunity could achieve, and it made me a kind of Tory in that sense. And I slightly lost the thread of where your question was.
It's just how did you transition into the politics from being in business?
Yeah,
because like I say, there are lots of people who've been in politics since day dot, really. And businessmen in particular like to think they get into politics, but they tend not to get into politics, but sit on the periphery. But seeing the transition that you've made, a very successful businessman, been in business for a lot of years, but actually built an extremely successful political career. I'm interested why you made the transition, and two, how that came about.
So I got very interested in business. Did all that stuff in the UK, did that in the US. When I was younger, I was interested in politics. When I went to Oxford, I was president of the Oxford Union and the president of the University Conservative Association, and I hung around with people like William Hague and the Boris Johnson and all those sort of characters that were there at the time, and I was very, very political. I suppose that was a bit of my life I kind of parked because I wanted to go out and do something in the world. I wanted to go out and achieve things, and that's what I did through business. And then finally I reached a point, just as Cameron actually had been elected leader, when I thought, I've got some experience behind me, and I'm fed up with going down the pub and complaining about this and moaning about this, and if only people did things differently and so on and so forth. Now's the time to actually go into Parliament. And I was then in my mid-40s. And David Cameron actually created the A-list at that point, if you remember. There were 100 MPs on it.
Were you an A-lister?
Yeah, and I thought, well, I'll come over the hill on my horse out of the blue, and I'll apply to this thing. And if he's as good as his word, and he wants new talent that hasn't been constantly in the political firmament for years, but doing other things, then maybe there'll be a place for me. And I got interviewed actually a couple of times, and once was by Justine Greening actually,
right,
and somebody else from the party, and they said, "Oh, talk to me about campaigning," and I just got on incredibly well with them and got through, and I was actually in the end the first A-lister to be selected, which I don't think was what the party had intended, because I think I was meant to have been female and probably from an ethnic minority or whatever. But here I was, this 45-year-old white man, and I got selected for Central Devon, and the rest, as they say, politically is history.
But the process obviously worked, because you've had a long
Well,
career.
I would like to think so, because I was not the typical candidate. I was older, I'd done different things outside.
And did you do when you go through the candidate selection process, did they have the new candidate selection process in place where it was almost kind of a full day of interviews and workshops and group?
Yes.
I remember going through mine in 2012, and you had like an inbox exercise, interviews, essays. I mean, it was quite
It was exactly
process.
like that, yes. And I think there was one bit where you had to speak for 2 minutes on a particular topic or something.
That they give you as you walk into the room.
Yes, as you walk in. And I remember on that, I did exactly 2 minutes. Just as I finished the last one, he said, time. So it was probably that did it, Ben, you see.
Must have been. Keeping good time is important in politics. Not many people do that.
Yes.
Did you always know you wanted to go into politics at some point then? It kind of sounds like, given you... certainly in your younger life around Oxford Union.
Yeah, certainly by the time I was at Oxford, I felt very political in the sense that I felt very strongly about being a conservative and the importance of conservatism and all of that kind of stuff. So I suppose it had been in my blood since the age of about 20, I guess. But as I say, it was there in my family, but not in a very explicit way. And I can remember the 1974 two elections. Now, I would have been very young then, before you were born, actually. And there was an election in February and one in October. I'm not sure which one it was. But I can remember hearing the results come in and not fully understanding what it meant. But I remember my parents being very vexed about which results went which way. And so I suppose I had that emotional connection to politics mattering, rather than necessarily it being overtly conservative.
It's
in that
really
explicit
interesting you
way.
say that. I mean, I had the exact same experience in... I'm a little bit younger than you, Mel. I had the exact same experience in 1997.
Yes.
You know, I was young.
Yes.
I was nearly 11.
Yes.
But again, not a political family.
Now, what were you? Were you a conservative at that point? Were you? You were just.
I didn't know politics.
You didn't know
was a thing.
one thing from another.
I literally didn't. I mean, I was 10 years old, right?
Yes. Yes.
But again, similar background to yours. My father was a police officer. Mother was a teacher. Actually, owned her own business at the time. She was in publishing. Actually.
Okay.
It's very odd, Mel. We've definitely not set this one up. But I remember waking up the morning after the election, and they only remember it because the thing that was seared into my mind is that famous kind of, I think it was a video rather than a picture of Tony Blair down by the Thames with Diane Abbott and a couple of other people. Yes. And I remember being at home and my parents talking about the election. And it's the first time they'd ever talked about capital P politics. Same way, my dad's a police officer, right? So they're always talking about justice and problems with this and problems with that. And my mother's a teacher, as well as running her own business. And I just remember this thing that I'd never heard of before being extremely important and relevant within all of a sudden my sphere of consciousness. Yes. And it just kind of triggered something in me to kind of say, well, hang on, this sounds actually really interesting and exciting. Yes. What's it about? It was never for me, I'm Labour or Conservative at the time. It was just, oh, hang on, there's this whole new thing that I never knew of. And I think for me anyway, a different time, going into New Labour in 97, going into secondary comprehensive school and kind of growing up with a Labour Party, all of a sudden you kind of have an awakening. And I think I was driven by being in the Northeast, being a bit of a contrarian, but also seeing, in effect, from my point of view, wall-to-wall Labour council since the war. We now had 13 years of a Labour government, and my politics is quite simple in that they had no one else to blame, right? In the 80s, the local councils could blame Thatcher, but when I was growing up, there was nobody else to blame, and I kind of thought, well, hang on, it's not working for us, so there must be a better way of doing it. That was how I first kind of started to lean towards the Conservatives in kind of my teenage years, but it sounds not dissimilar to your kind of exposure to politics in your early years as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things, and obviously with this being in partnership with Conservative Home, Anna Firth, MP, did a really interesting article recently, and she set out 3 questions. So these are not my questions, these are hers. And I thought they were really good questions that we should ask. And one of them seems like a really obvious question, but it's difficult, I think, when you get into the nooks of it as to how you answer it. To you, Mel, as a leadership contender, I mean, we can talk about the wider leadership and we'll get on to it. But the first basic question has to be, what makes you a Conservative? Why are you a Conservative? I mean, I've touched upon very briefly kind of my journey, but why are you a Conservative? Why didn't you end up, a Lib Dem or, a Labour supporter? What was it about the principles? What is it about the Conservative Party that made you identify
What
with
made me a Conservative was lived experience, I would say. So it is some of the things we've touched on. It was growing up as a young person in a family where I saw my father start his own business, sometimes struggle with it, but ultimately succeed with it. And I saw us improving our lot through time as a consequence of our united endeavours as a family. A family in which my mother and father left school at 15 and 14 years old, in which I got a free place at a grammar school and then got a place at Oxford University that transformed my life. Living in a Britain where Margaret Thatcher made home ownership a big thing and something that was attainable then, and getting the keys to my first property, which was hugely important. All of that experience taught me that aspiration and opportunity and achievement mattered. And by extension, it didn't just matter in a selfish kind of way. It actually mattered to your family. It mattered to the community you lived in. It mattered when you sort of replicated times tens and tens of thousands of people doing these kind of things. It matters to society more generally, in the economy and so on. It makes us stronger. So I suppose at my core, what made me a Conservative is a belief in aspiration, social mobility and opportunity. Those were things, I loved it when Maggie gave people the opportunity to own their own home by selling council. Now you can criticise whether she should have hypothecated the money to build more houses or whatever, but the basic principle I thought was incredible. A share-owning democracy, getting capitalism working in a way and being in many ways more inclusive. You can say in some ways it was less inclusive, but in many ways more inclusive. Those were the kind of touchstones that drew me very strongly into the Conservative campaign.
Well, there seems to be an interesting point, particularly about share ownership, which I think has certainly been caricatured in recent years with Margaret Thatcher. I mean, I was just reading something the other day that during that kind of mass privatisation, particularly of the utilities in the 80s. I mean, I think there was a time in the 80s where more than 50% of all shares traded in the UK stock market were owned by private individuals rather than institutions, and we've come a long way from that. So, that's an example. You've touched upon many others, but
Yes.
Given that that's why you're a conservative, how do those principles, how does that experience in life that made you a conservative, how is that going to impact your decision making should you become leader of the party? How is that going to influence you on a day-to-day basis?
So I think we have to create the environment in which the story that I have told can be facilitated. So we have to create that environment in which people want to go out, start things, create things, etc. And I think tax is a part of that. So I think we need to have the right tax environment, and that's why I think taxes need to be lower. And one of the ways in which you do that is to build an economy in which you have the fiscal space in order to reduce taxes. And the route to that in turn is through economic growth and increasing productivity, which since about 2008 and the financial crisis have become fairly anemic. And there are lots of strands that then feed into that, including getting up private investment, getting the level of public investment to be more productive.
Issues around regulation, planning.
Planning and skills and all of those kind of infrastructure and all of those kind of things. But actually with public investment in the public sector, too much of it has gone into the revenue side. So you take the NHS rather than the capital side of things. The NHS is consuming ever more money. Even in the papers today, it's saying we need another 3 billion if we're going to get on top of these, backlogs and so on and so forth. Too much of it has gone into just basically stopgapping on the revenue side. Gone into wages and recruiting more people. Not enough has gone into the systems and the tech and the way that the basic nuts and bolts of the operation work. So it's just not efficient enough. So all of those questions, to answer your question, are the source of the river that will flow into making all these wonderful things happen and meeting many other challenges. But the biggest challenge that we've got as a party is to come up with a credible economic platform that provides fiscal space to drop taxes and do other things that we'll need to do, social care challenges and challenges of reaching out to younger people, for example. It's all going to cost money ultimately at the end of the day, and you've got to find that space to do it. So it's a big economic challenge.
It is, and I can't disagree with anything you say, Mel, but to play devil's advocate here,
do Mel.
It feels to me, some might say, well, that sounds very similar to what Keir Starmer wants to do. Grow the economy. We're not going to have austerity, we're not going to raise taxes, albeit now they're saying they're going to raise taxes, but his whole pitch was economic growth to create that fiscal headroom.
So we agree on the tree that should be barked up. But he's got the wrong dog. Okay, mine's a different dog that's doing the barking. Okay, he believes in growth and he believes in increasing productivity, but his solution actually is a kind of command and control centrist approach. He's going to be putting up taxes in October. He's ducking a lot of the tough challenges which would allow him not to have to do a lot of the things that he says he's now going to do.
In what ways?
Such as welfare. Take welfare. Okay. Now that was a budget that I was responsible for. Due to the fundamental changes that I brought in, for example, we've saved billions of pounds from that budget. 400,000 plus fewer people going on to long-term sickness and disability benefits, according to the OBR, as a consequence of the reforms that I brought into the work capability assessments, for example. And I had other reforms coming down the line, some of which, for example, fed into our manifesto offer, which was to cut national insurance to the point where we abolished employee national insurance altogether. The money to do that, which is about 18 billion, 12 of it came from reforms that were in hand at my department. So the answer to your question is those are the things you need to do, which are tough and difficult things to do if you're going to, be barking up a tree that ends up bearing some fruit, if that's not mixing too many metaphors.
It was interesting because I was there at the manifesto launch and Rishi talked a lot about this policy that you helped develop around cutting the benefits bill. In a very, that's a broad term. There's lots to that. And he talked a lot about it having bloomed since COVID and thought actually the targets that we'd set ourselves were reasonable actually in being able to cut that bill to be able to create the fiscal headroom. But it's something that I thought, particularly during the election campaign, kind of went largely unnoticed. And it wasn't something that we pushed particularly hard, but actually those are, just remind people, for those that are listening, the eye-watering sums we're talking about that are involved in the wider benefits bill.
So, for example, if you take an area of reform that I was driving that would have yielded a lot of the savings that we're talking about to cut national insurance, personal independence payment. So that is currently forecast to increase by about £10 billion. That's the increase, not the total spend, over the next 5 years. So that and other examples of that scale are just unsustainable. And you end up with a benefit system that is just costing too much, and the taxpayer loses confidence in it. So there's some big numbers there that if you get the reform right, you can actually squeeze out of the system and have a better system. Because in the case of PIP, personal independence payments, that's there as a contribution to the additional costs, for example, of disability, it's very, very blunt. So you could be given large amounts of money, relatively, and only need a few aids and appliances, which actually you might in turn already be receiving via the NHS or your local authority. And that is just too blunt. We need to be much sharper as to how we target benefits than we are at the moment. But why wasn't Labour talking about it in the general election? Because in their heart of hearts, they know something needs to be done. But the politics for the Labour Party is truly dreadful, because you're going to have to go in and do battle with various groups and interest groups who are going to make it very difficult for you. Your own backbenchers will probably be divided on a lot of the decisions that we need to take. Now, what will be interesting is what do they say about welfare on the 30th of October when Rachel Reeves makes a budget statement.
Well, we've seen some of this with the...
But we've not heard anything so far.
We haven't, but other than the cutting of the winter fuel payments, which is...
Well, yes.
You know, I know you've got some kind of strong views on that, particularly with the actual savings not being the savings that they think they're going to save. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Well, no, exactly right. So what they've said is they're going to means test it, which means that you have to be on pension credit in order to qualify for it. We know there are 800,000 people not on pension credit who could be. There has to be an assumption that a number of those, say a quarter, 200,000, actually now migrate onto pension credit, which is an additional cost to the cost that there was before. And that could erode probably about a third of the £1.5 billion that they say they're going to save as a consequence of this measure. But look, if they're doing that at the same time as going out to their union paymasters and giving in on all these salary increases, wage increases, particularly not having any strings attached in terms of wanting additional productivity as a consequence, then that's a rather unfortunate juxtaposition when you're looking at what will be potentially millions of elderly people shivering away this winter.
And I think there are a lot of questions that need answering here, because you're right, I think they're fudging the whole process. I think one of the things they're benefiting from is the lack of leadership within the Conservative Party as we go through this leadership election, because there isn't a real opposition that needs to hold the government to account.
I think on that though, Ben, we've been fairly vocal. I mean, you look at the Daily Express. I mean, I think they've run their campaign against this, fuelled with comments from us as a government, as an opposition, for quite a while now, and in quite a dramatic fashion. So I think we are getting that message out to a degree on that. But you're right, there'll be a bit of a lull while we find our leader and we start to fire up and
exactly, it's not
in
far
anger
to go.
again. Yeah.
So I mean, coming on to I suppose the key part that I'm sure people are interested in, we've got the leadership contest coming up. You are one of the contenders, which is why you sat here today, so thank you for doing that. And really, I was going to ask you a very broad question. You know, why would a Conservative member, or why should the country back a Mel Stride Conservative Party? What is your vision for the Conservative Party should you become leader?
Okay, so we are at a particular moment in the history of our party, and it's highly perilous. We know what happened in the general election. We lost 2/3 of our MPs down to 121 of us in Parliament. It is not inconceivable, if things go really badly, that this is an existential threat to our political party. What is needed now more than anything else is leadership to unite the parliamentary party and to build that winning platform so that we can get into political contention. The second thing we need to do actually is around party organisation, to transform ourselves into a really strong, locally focused campaign machine. And that's an operation that we need to work out through CCHQ and a lot of reform there. Why me? Well, it gets back to what we were discussing earlier, really. It's about leadership, and it's about somebody who's had the real life experience of that and can bring that to the party. And as I said earlier, I went into Parliament aged 48, built those businesses up from scratch over all those years. And I believe that I have the experience and the drive, the determination to deliver on those things. In terms of the vision, We have got to get an economic platform together that provides us with that fiscal space to do a lot of things that we will want to do. One of them is we've got to solve the problem of the fact that the average Conservative voter in the last election was 63 years old. That is totally unsustainable. And therefore, one of the things we're going to have to do is have a big, bold offer for young people. Now, housing is going to be absolutely critical to that, and there's a lot of supply side reforms that we need to look at, including planning and the kind of things that you've been focused on. But equally, I think there are some demand side offers that we should be making to younger people. So I floated the idea, for example, that for a first job, which would by definition tend to go to younger people, the first £5,000 of national insurance, rather than going to the taxman, should be hypothecated into an ISA that could in turn be used as a deposit against a future property purchase. And I think the advantage of that, as well as accelerating getting young people onto the property ladder, is it demonstrates that lower taxes actually have a meaning, a real direct personal meaning. And I think we need lots of that, but we need to crack the growth and the productivity puzzle in order to generate the fiscal space to do those things and other things like solve the social care problem, have a credible offer on that. Reform public services. It's a huge amount of work that we've got to put together.
Just to go through a few of those things, because it's really interesting. I mean, so the unity point is something that everybody's talking about, not just the leadership contenders, but I think it's widely recognised that one of the main reasons we lost the last election, particularly from your average person in the street who isn't politically engaged, they saw a Conservative Party that was fighting with itself, that couldn't agree on a position, and as I know, nobody votes for a party that is divided. It feels to me like the parliamentary party is in an interesting place, given that we've only got 121 left. It feels to me, and you tell me you're in the parliamentary party, I'm not, that the parliamentary party is not a single entity, but it feels to me like those MPs that are left are largely of a type of conservatism where that kind of unity should be able to come about with a leader that has a strong vision and wants to work hard to bring the parliamentary party back into the fold. But also, so I welcome your thoughts on that. But also the second point is, my personal view is that the parliamentary party of its makeup is probably not aligned necessarily with the membership. I think the makeup of the parliamentary party is probably not necessarily reflective of the spectrum of the membership. So how do we bring not just the parliamentary party together, but the wider Conservative family together to know that we're all moving in the same direction, to bring strong opposition to bear that will hopefully lead to a Conservative government, ideally at the next election, but certainly in the future. So we avoid that cataclysmic position where the Conservative Party is in, is potentially, things could get worse rather than better.
So in terms of where is the parliamentary party at the moment, it's just had a huge wake-up call. Okay, there's been a terrible accident. We've all crawled out of the wreckage. So I think the mindset is one of, this is do or die now. Either we come together or we are just going to be disintegrate entirely. And there's always been.
Do you think that's true?
I know. I do.
People talk about this, but you often politics comes in cycles. And '97 we had 160 left, I think, and people thought that was the end of the Conservative Party. Is this just one of those cycles?
No,
or is it potentially exponential?
The leadership of the Conservative Party will in part determine the answer to that question, whether we're going to come back or not. That's the biggest factor. And you're absolutely right that there are no rules left in politics, I think, is the way I would phrase it, in the sense that if I was a socialist talking to you now about the 2019 election, you might say to me, this is your worst defeat since the 1930s. You are going to be out of power for a generation. This could be the end of the Labour Party. And I'd be jabbering away trying to explain why that wasn't going to happen. Well, look what happened just 5 years later. You've got the biggest landslide for, almost in history. So I don't think there is any sense in the party that we cannot get back. And also, if you look at how shallow, in a way, this wide majority that Labour has actually is. But in terms of an apparent dislocation between the parliamentary party and the membership, I actually think there's more that we've got in common that is separating us here. So the traditional sort of right-wing issues, and you think of reform of net migration and illegal migration and lower tax, etc., I think are common ground issues. And I think if you were in the tea room at the House of Commons talking to MPs across the piece, I think most of them would recognise we need to push really hard in all of those areas. So there are one or two areas. ECHR approach to that would be one which would separate perhaps and divide the parliamentary party.
Do you
But
think it would separate you from the majority of the
well,
parliamentary party as well as the members?
What's
your position on that?
My position is we should not allow anything, ECHR included, to serve as a barrier that stops us creating an effective deterrent to stop people coming over here illegally. And that is the line in the sand which, just has to stay there. But firstly, we're 5 years away from a general election, and we don't know what Labour will be doing on net migration by the time. I mean, if you can tell me what it's going to look like in 3 or 4 years, then you've got a better crystal ball than I have. That's one reason for not jumping in with a stark position that paints us in at this stage. The second reason is part of driving unity in the parliamentary party and good leadership will be an inclusive approach to arriving at answers to the question that you've just posed. So far better to go to the parliamentary party and say, we've got a lot of time to think about our pitch on migration. We've got to get this right, and we've got to unite. And the ECHR is going to be part of that discussion. Let's get together and let's work out what we're going to do through time. Okay, got plenty of time to get policy together. The mistake will be, I know that a subset of the membership really wants to hear me say, I will leave the ECHR. I won't even wait till the end of next week. The first thing I do, when I get the chance, is I will rip this thing up and I will publicly burn it outside the House of Commons. And I'll tip a bucket and I'll stamp it into the ground. And, and they'll be cheering from the rafters. The problem is that when that victor then goes back to the parliamentary party and says, here I am, follow me, half of them will say, I've got a real problem with some of the things you've committed to. And that is something we need to avoid. So I can understand the temptation, but it should be avoided.
And it's a really interesting one for all leadership contenders, because there are others who've taken maybe not kind of ripping it up, burning it in the street and burying it.
I was getting a bit carried away there, Ben.
But to be fair, the sentiment is right in that others have said we should leave the ECHR. We just need to leave, take back control.
Which is complicated.
It is complicated.
Think of Northern Ireland. And most people they say, I feel very passionate about the. And you say, well, what about the impact on the Good Friday Agreement and stability in Northern Ireland? They look at you rather blankly. There is a lot to this that is not immediately.
And I don't disagree. Absolutely. I don't disagree. But as we've seen already with some of the hustings, and when I speak to members, members more so than the parliamentary party have more of a black and white view on these things. And it's not clear cut. I'm not saying all members think we should leave the ECHR. Actually, I think there's a much more nuanced view of the membership than certainly the mainstream media have of the Conservative Party. I think they're a much more nuanced people. I think they are much more thoughtful on their positions. But there will be a substantial number that if you want to get the backing of the membership, others are gambling on the fact that of them having a very black and white view on the ECHR will stand them in good stead with the membership. And it gets back to this point, how do you bring... And if they're right, and you might say, actually, Ben, I dismiss the premise, but if they're right, then there is a problem or something that has to be done about the unity of the party where you're going to see, because I don't disagree, I think there will be a substantial number in the parliamentary party that feel uncomfortable with that, but the membership, if others are to be believed, will be very comfortable with it. And that comes back to a point of leadership, and people like, I think, the clarity of a clear position, but I also don't necessarily disagree that, one of the lines I always use in politics every day is, there's no such thing as black and white, everything's lived in the grey. But in recent years, the grey doesn't get much of a hearing when it comes to politics, and does that risk you kind of walking down the middle of the road and getting hit by a car rather than taking a position?
You have to be true to yourself, and what I would say is that in the hustings, if a question comes to me and I think, well, I know what the clever answer is in terms of leaning into what people want to hear, I don't tend to do that. And what I find is that if I take a counter position, provided I argue my case convincingly and with passion and sincerity, they may be silent in that room, these people, but there are a substantial number of people who will respect you for doing that and will say, actually, you haven't just gone with the crowd. You've actually told us what you think, and I respect you for saying that. So I think that is quite an important point, actually, in these kind of discussions, is authenticity and being true to yourself, and not necessarily just leaning the way you think the room is leaning.
Do you think
because leadership is about that. It's sometimes going against the grain.
Absolutely.
I don't actually agree with the majority at this particular moment in time. I can lead us to a place where perhaps ultimately people will look back and say, you were right.
And there is something really powerful in that. I mean, one of my views of leadership is it's very easy to be a leader in good times when, there is a wave and you're riding the crest of the wave. But actually strong, good leadership is sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes taking people to a place where they don't necessarily want to go to, but understanding that in the medium to long term, that's ultimately going to create a better outcome. Where in hindsight, people might think that that's a good thing. But as with politics, unfortunately, it's quite short-termist, and it's that balance, isn't it? And I think it also leads into this other question that I saw come out time and time again. And I know, having listened to you at the hustings, you've got a good anecdote on this. I hope that you'll repeat it for the listeners, in that people didn't know what we stood for. And if we are a little bit too grey, if we're a little bit too nuanced, then, Mrs. or Mrs. Smith, Mr. or Mrs. Smith in the street won't understand what the Conservative Party stands for. So does that kind of push against, because I know you believe this as well, we've got a real problem with what does the Conservative Party stand for. Does that nuance, again, not lead us down a slightly more difficult position if we're not very clear on what the Conservative values and what we stand for are and how we communicate that with the public?
So I think that this argument that I'm putting forward, that means you don't just follow the crowd, and the argument that says that sometimes there are easy routes that you're best to avoid even if they're popular, doesn't mean that you can't be clear about what you stand for. And that indeed, I think, to a degree, is what we definitely lost. And my little anecdote, just to...
Oh, it's a good one.
Now you've teased it in for your listeners.
Day, absolutely.
Yeah, it is when the general election in Devon, and I was standing outside a supermarket, and this man came up to me and he said, "You're Mel Stride, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You're an excellent local MP." And I said, "Thank you." And I said, "Are you going to vote for me?" And he said, "No." So I said, "Oh." I said, "Who are you going to vote for?" He said, "Reform." So I said, "Well, is that because of net migration?" He said, "No." I said, "Is that because we didn't stop the boats?" He said, "No." I said, "Is that because of taxes are too high?" He said, "No." So I said, "Well, why is it?" And he said, "It's because I no longer know what your party stands for." Okay. And that, in essence, is an essential truth.
It is.
It has been obscured. Now, you can argue about why it's been obscured, and I think, to be fair, externalities, things have been done to us over the last decade that have caused part of that problem. COVID, the shrinking of the UK economy by 10% overnight, the import of inflation because of the Ukraine war, those things necessitated spending £400 billion supporting the economy and families up and down the country. And it was the right thing to do. But it turned us from what would naturally be a Conservative Party that doesn't splurge the cash into one that had to, and rightly did.
Yep.
And it did obscure and hamper our ability to do more obviously Conservative things. So I think we did have our hands tied behind our backs in a way on that score. But nonetheless, however it happened, we've got to get back to that clarity, that vision. And it is all, I think, centred on aspiration and opportunity. I think that's at the core of it.
And it's also, I think ultimately everything comes back to the economy. I think it's all about sound public finance, which is something we've always been known as a party to be able to do. And it goes back to, I suppose, 2005, 2010, David Cameron. And one of the things that I got really frustrated about during the election was this idea that the Labour Party were allowed to trot out this line of 14 years of Conservative chaos. And it stuck, right? It did stick. People thought, 14 years, everything's got worse. It's like, well, hang on.
Yeah.
We won in 2010. We won in 2015. We did win in 2017. We won comfortably in 2019.
Yeah.
So people were pretty happy with 10 years of a Conservative government.
Yes.
Can't have been that bad.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that we massively missed out during the election campaign, and actually really since the Liz Truss era, was we kind of just ignored that COVID had happened. Whereas when you go back to Cameron and Osborne in the run up to 2010, they were saying some pretty real things to people, which again, that point about leadership you were talking about, not necessarily going with the grain, saying if you elect us, we're going to have to take some very difficult decisions. This is why. It's almost like we didn't do that. And I kind of felt like from 21 to 22 onwards, we should have been saying we've just spent north of £500 billion.
Yes.
This is the impact it has. We had to do it.
Yes.
But by the way, it's going to have this impact and we're going to have to make some very real decisions. And it was almost, to some extent, the Conservative Party didn't want to make those decisions as well as the Labour Party in the election. It's like there was a bit of a false election going on where nobody really wanted to address the elephant in the room, which was this huge expenditure.
No, I think that's right. The number of times I've stood up there in a village hall and taken questions, and somebody will stand up and say, "I'm really vexed about X. You don't talk enough about X." And I'm standing there thinking there are, 2,000 things we could be talking about that are important to people, and there's not the bandwidth to get your message across. But I think on the big things, your point is well made, and we probably should have pushed that message harder. One of the big problems, you mentioned the economy, is we lost our reputation for sound financial management, and it went in a flash, and it will be very hard and long, hard yards to get it back again. And to think that the Labour Party were happy to drag us onto that territory and beat us on that territory is quite extraordinary for a party that has prided itself on sound money and fiscal responsibility for many, many years. Is pretty shocking.
I mean, that's, to be fair, a large part of your platform, isn't it, for economic competence? And just a couple of things of the things that you've said, but also you've said elsewhere. You've talked about a new deal for members and reform of CCHQ.
Yeah.
Again, I think some others are talking about that. I know it's something I believe in as well.
I was the first to talk about it.
No, you were,
Ben,
absolutely. Well, it'd be more
where
interesting.
I go, others follow.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks, won't we?
We will.
But specifically, what does that mean in practice? So how do you reform CCHQ? What does that look like? And what is a new deal for members? So what does that actually mean to the members?
So the new deal for members means you no longer pay £39 just to get an endless stream of emails from the centre asking for more cash.
I think I've had 3 in the time we've been in this podcast.
Yeah, at least 3, and there'll be 3 waiting for you afterwards as well.
Yeah.
And you turn it into something that's about value and engagement, and building a community. I mean, why shouldn't it be like the acid test? The litmus test is you want a member to have an app on their phone, and at least once a week to be tapping on it to see what's going on, what they can sign up to, what they can get involved with locally, events, whatever, what offers there and benefits there might be coming down the line because I'm a member, So that's sort of what it looks and feels like. The second thing is associations have got to be respected.
Is that like a Groupon for the Conservative Party?
I would not describe it like that, but look, the people that do it brilliantly, actually, in part at least, are trade unions, right?
Okay.
So they have millions of members, and they hold those members, and they pay very substantial subscriptions, and at the end of the day, they do it for a purpose. Now, I totally accept that trade unions are very different as membership from our membership, but the basic principle, I think, is still there. You have to work harder at holding on to and promoting membership. Second thing is respect of associations. So we've got to get rid of this parachuting in at the last minute of parliamentary candidates against the will of local associations. They've got to be in early and selected and voted in by local associations.
But isn't that always the case anyway?
No, certainly.
I mean, there were maybe
it wasn't in the last election.
I think there were maybe one or two exceptions, but generally, even a shortlist is put in front of members, right? Associations do select their candidates.
The general perceived wisdom out there amongst associations, and I talk to a lot of them, is that this is a real bugbear, and I think it's one of the things that you can very simply fix on day one. Actually,
and is this the bugbear of people? Because again, for listeners who might not be aware, my experience of it is, you've got to be on the candidates list. So you've got to be an approved candidate. You get kind of vetted before you can apply for seats. Yeah. You then apply for seats, and then there is a process through CCHQ. And then ultimately, a number of candidates are put forward to associations for consideration. And sometimes, I've been involved in processes where that can be 10, 15, 20, and then the membership kind of bring that down, and then it goes to in effect, it goes to an association executive with who are obviously voted by the members. But then ultimately, a shortlist of 3 or 4 will go in front of the membership of that association, and they'll select. I think the bugbear you're talking about is this feeling that the list that they get is kind of foisted upon them, and it's not as organic as it could be in the association, and the members don't have as much say in that. Or are you talking about something slightly different?
So I think there have even been instances, and I'm not going to get into specifics because it involves individuals, absolutely. But let me just put it this way, of the centre basically mandating this is going to be your candidate. I mean, that's what you've got to get away from, and that's what I would say to you. But to get back to CCHQ reform, I'll give you an example of how it would be working properly and effectively. Will be, as leader, I would expect to walk into CCHQ and go up to what's probably a combination of our digital function, rebuttal function, and research function, and say to somebody, right, let's pick a county at random, Devon, right? I want you to tell me what the issues are in Devon at the local level. I want you to tell me what position every single opposition councillor is taking on those issues. I want you to tell me what our group is taking on those issues. And most critical of all, I want you to show me the digital and non-digital ammunition that you are generating in conjunction with them that is allowing them to fight that battle on the ground. And if they can't answer any of those questions, then there's something going wrong. And at the moment, I think very few of those questions are able to be answered. Now, the good news is I don't think that requires a boatload of cash to fix that. it is one of those 80-20 things that
Yeah.
I think you can juggle around and get different people in and so on. Oh, and incidentally, by different people, no disrespect to the people involved at all, at the moment, at all, but there is a reservoir of brilliant campaigners out there, right? Unsung heroes. Let's find them. Let's bring them in to the centre.
Yep.
Let's at least learn from them, if nothing else, and get a really strong tiger team in at the middle. And we can do it in an 80-20 fairly quick fashion. And we need to if we're going to do well in May. So sometimes people have said to me, what's going to be in your in tray on day one as leader of our party? The first thing is that. Is right up there with forming a shadow cabinet, is getting CCHQ to the point that I've just described.
We'll be 6 months out from local elections.
It's desperately short of time. Whereas the policy track, we've got plenty of time and shouldn't rush it.
And so, moving on, I suppose, to that campaigning element, whether it's in May next year, which absolutely right, I think is critical for the next few years, building that kind of local base of councillors and activists to be able to build upon. You know, one of the things, before we come to the end of this, we have to talk about, because I think it's a key question that everybody's talking about, but also members, is the reform question. You know, we were, I think in large parts of the country, we were split with reform. Particularly in places like my patch in Teesside, if you look at the seats that we lost, you know, there is an accepted wisdom that if reform hadn't have stood, we would have probably kept, of the 5 or 6 MPs we had in Teesside, we'd have probably kept 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah.
But again, the argument against that, actually, Simon Clarke, the former MP for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland, you know, he didn't have a reform candidate, lost by 100 votes.
Yeah.
And I think it would be fair, Simon probably now thinks that had he had a reform candidate, he probably would have won.
Right.
So, you know, what's the Mel Stride approach to the reform question, and how do we deal with that?
So I think the first thing is what I wouldn't do, which is I would not be getting into bed with Nigel Farage and populism and any of that stuff. But what I would be doing is reaching out to those voters on the issues that matter.
So when you say not into bed, would you...
So I wouldn't have him in the Conservative Party. I wouldn't be doing an overt deal with Reform.
So you wouldn't have a partnership with Reform?
No, I wouldn't. I think it's a very dangerous road to go down, actually. And one of the dangers in British politics generally, I think, is the kind of populism that you're seeing in the United States and other European countries, and that really worries me. And I see that in Nigel Farage. Okay, so I wouldn't be doing that, but I would be reaching out on those issues that matter. So we've discussed, you know, migration and net migration and illegal migration and lower taxes and all of those kind of things. But I would also be recognising that those people that voted Reform, probably about 20% of them would otherwise have voted Lib Dem or Labour. So they're not all Conservatives.
Absolutely.
And if the Reform Party hadn't existed, not all of those that remain would have come into our column. Some of them would have stayed at home.
Yeah.
And what they've lost faith in, I suspect if you had a large group of them around a table and you spoke to lots of Reform voters, they would raise migration and things, but they would also raise the things that we talked about earlier, the lack of trust of the Conservative Party because of the way that we behaved and our track record on delivery, which was your great saving grace. And I know we discussed it when I came up to see you. And I asked you that question, you know, why have you been so successful relatively to everybody else? And you quite rightly said, you know, I went out and I promised things and I delivered on them. And that's what we didn't do. So if we can do that and be an effective opposition, choose our targets, go in deep where it matters to people, and look like we're a functioning political party again that can say things and you believe that they'll deliver on them and you trust their values, they're kind of people like you and me. You feel that sort of feeling about them. I think a lot of those people will naturally come back anyway. Okay, but we've got to address the issues that matter to them at the same time.
And do you think, you know, lots of people out there think we have to kind of pick and choose, right? Some people think we need to kind of woo that Reform group back, and I think you're absolutely right. I think there are lots of people who vote Reform who probably don't vote full stop or wanting to vote Reform to send a signal. I think a lot of it is about trust and competence. Absolutely agree. But the other side of the coin is, well, you can't woo that voter as well as trying to deal with the Lib Dems now in what were the traditional Tory heartlands. Do you buy that as an argument? Or?
No, I think you can become a competent mainstream political party that is really at home with its values of aspiration and opportunity and all the things that make us Conservatives, and reach out to the Reform voters at the same time as reassuring those people that have left us for Labour and the Lib Dems that we have a plan for the economy that will work, that can be inclusive, that sees well-run public services at its heart, that resolves some of these intergenerational issues that we've spoken about with younger people and what stake they've got in society and the economy, and build better jobs, the sort of thing that you've done up in Teesside. I think if you can present that and it's credible, and the OBR says it's credible, and the IFS and everybody else says this is a really good plan, then I think we can do a lot with that right across the political spectrum.
And I think a big part of that, and you've touched on it a couple of times, is strong leadership, bringing the party together in unity. But it's also about party discipline, and I think that's something that lots of people outside of the political Conservative Party talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
But actually, there was a huge cut-through issue there. Lots of people in the street were just fed up of blue-on-blue attacks, Conservatives writing columns in, various newspapers, slagging each other off, slagging off the leadership. Again, if you're fortunate enough to become the leader of the Conservative Party, what does party discipline look like to you, and how do you enforce that?
So I think
because there's a difference between there's a bit of, it's a stick and a carrot thing, right? You want to lead people to come along with you.
Yes.
But ultimately politicians are politicians, right? And so there always has to be an element of stick and and how do you manage that party unity, but the discipline side in particular?
I think the first thing is that you try and avoid getting into a position where you've even got to reach for the stick. Okay, and what that is about is leading in a way that includes people, respects people's opinions, gets people to buy into the project, waters the plants enough to make sure we all stay together. All the sort of soft stuff around that is actually really, really important. Stuff you see in business all around you where they're doing it well. The second thing, though, is that if the stick has to come out, get it out early, right? And what we've done in the past is I think we have tolerated situations that have rumbled on for too long, have got worse and worse and worse, and in many cases drastic action has ultimately had to be taken. So we got all the pain at the end of the day, but we had all the rumbling of it in the meantime as well, and prompter action would actually have been the result. One of the first things I do, actually forming my shadow cabinet, would be I'd have each member of the shadow cabinet in for a chat. I would talk about what they were missioned to do, and I give them a letter very clearly setting out all the things that we agree between us they should be doing. The second thing I would do is I would talk about standards. Now, we know there are Nolan principles and all sorts of things floating around, and the ministerial code and all of that stuff. It doesn't get enough focus. And I would have the eyeball-to-eyeball chat, friendly chat, and I would say, look, this is how I'm going to run things. If some of these things happen, it will not be tolerated. And you need to know that. And I think that probably is an element of leadership that's been missing for too long at the top of our party. Now, I don't say that by way of saying that anybody didn't care about those issues. Of course they did. But actually sitting down with somebody right at the start and saying this is how it's going to be, I think is really powerful and important. Just
before we wrap up, obviously we are still in the middle of the leadership contest. How do you think it's going? How's the campaign going, Mel?
So I don't
How's
think
the support going? Well, have you got enough numbers? Have you got the numbers to get through?
Well, no. I was asked this by. Am I allowed to mention the Daily Telegraph? Has just given me an interview. Yeah. I was asked that, and I said I'm quietly confident about the first and second round. So I'm quietly confident that I have the numbers amongst my parliamentary colleagues. An interesting facet of this is if people are sort of pontificating about where people are in this race from the outside, whilst totally overlooking that the immediate electorate that matters is 121 people in Westminster. So they're looking at, there's this poll that says you got a net satisfaction rating better than all the other candidates amongst, I don't know, certain slice of the population on a Wednesday and, wherever it may be. It's not about that. It's about what that 121 are feeling. And I have a much better grip on that than most of the people out there commenting. And my view is, as I say, quiet confidence, taking nothing for granted.
No, absolutely.
But
you think you can count, as people say in politics, you can.
The first thing you got to do, the LBJ. The first thing you got to do is count. Yeah. Somebody said to me the other day, actually, the first rule is never presume. Yeah. That's the first rule of politics. So I don't think we can presume anything. But no, I'm feeling in a good position. And then if I get through the first stage, which I expect to, but if I do, it will then be a completely different ball game. We will then be out there with hustings. There'll be TV debates. I will become, my profile will go up and so on. I'll be able to demonstrate by speaking to people and orating and setting out my vision in a much more powerful way than I have been at the moment.
And I think just to wrap this up then, I mean, it's been a really interesting chat, Mel. I really appreciate your time. But, if people don't listen to all of this and we put some clips on social media and don't want to go and listen to the long thing, what is the elevator pitch? What is Mel? Who is Mel Stride, and why should people be voting for you in the leadership contest?
Okay, we can have a brilliant future as a party, but we need some fundamental reform, and the biggest thing we need is leadership. I went into Parliament aged 48, having set up my own businesses from scratch at the kitchen table here, and in the United States, drawing people together in a common purpose, climbing those metaphorical mountains. That's what I am going to deliver for the Conservative Party.
Brilliant. Well, Stein, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchin. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday, wherever you get your usual podcasts from.